For today's talk, I have actually taken a slightly different approach and a slightly different topic as well. This is not something which I do normally, and I'm not extremely well versed with this topic as well. I'm not an academician. I'm a very practitioner person. So, but for the last some time, I have been actually struggling with kind of grabbing this whole idea, especially when I became active and became part of the organization and the entity which is responsible for disaster risk reduction, or at least the funding part of the disaster risk reduction. So the talk is, today's talk is slightly theoretical, slightly more towards academic side. So what I'm intended to do is, share some thoughts with you that the way we perceive, the way we understand disasters, we might have been slightly or gravely mistaken about it. We might have taken a very surface or a superficial view of it. Disaster, I mean, many of you actually, you know what is a disaster. There is a standard definition. Vaishe sab kya hai wo definition? You know, it's a serious disruption which is beyond the coping capacity of a community or group of people or something like this. I think the problem or the challenge with this definition is there's a couple of elements into it, and if you understand it, there's an element of it, the suddenness, the element of surprise, that a disaster happens when we don't know that is going to happen. The other one is, which we have been taught about it, that it might be an act of God, you know. It might be something which is beyond our control, or what is called the natural disaster. So that's another aspect of it. The third aspect, of course, is that there's a very little room for us to do anything about it. You know, we are limited, we are incapacitated. So when a disaster comes, we basically have to address it. We have to provide the relief, which of course is extremely important. We have to follow it on, basically with the reconstruction, rehabilitation, and those kind of activities. So this is a perception in the literature, in the academic circle, which have evolved over the last many years, actually decades. But we are seeing a change in the last at least 15 to 20 years. And the change basically is saying that this is not like this. There is, the naturalness of the disaster might not be there. The disasters just don't happen. So this is the topic which actually I want to talk about it. By the way, who am I to talk about all this? I'm Bilal Anwar. Currently, I'm the CEO of National Disaster Risk Management Fund, NDRMF. It's a much easier way to say it. Previously, in my previous life, I have worked with the UN, and I burned a number of years in Africa, Europe, as well as Caribbean, Pacific Islands. So a number of places in South America as well, where actually I was blessed and I was privileged to work with communities, work with the governments, and work with the institutions. So I can say with a very high degree of confidence that I have some level of experience, some level of expertise to actually challenge this and question this notion, this understanding of it. Now, I think most importantly is the observations which actually went through while working in the climate action, the climate solutions, as well as the disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management and the disaster risk financing aspects of it. So I think the very first point is that no disaster is a natural disaster. I think we need to understand this. We need to internalize this. And what I mean to internalize, because many of you, I mean, I see some students here, many of you are the practitioners who are heading up some of the wonderful institutions or responsible institutions in the world, and including us as NDRMF, NDMA, and many other institutions. I think we need to internalize, we need to understand this, that no disaster is a natural disaster. I think we need to eradicate, we need to eliminate the natural disaster terminology from our heads, from our policy documents, from our project documents, and wherever actually we have the opportunity and wherever we have the scope of our work. And this is very important. I'm going to go a little bit into the details that why it is important and what kind of implications it had in the previous in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Actually, it limited the disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management approaches so severely, so significantly, that this might be one of the key reasons that even today we are struggling with it. And we are struggling in a very basic understanding of it. It's not like this, the practicalities of it. It's not like devising the project implementation plans. Or anything like this, the very basic and the fundamental understanding of it. So no disaster is a natural disaster. In every aspect of disaster, there's a strong element of social calculus. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, if you see in every aspect of a disaster, from causes, from vulnerability, from exposure, from preparedness, from prevention, from risk reduction, from risk assessment, there is a social calculus. And that social calculus, we have a wonderful terminology for it. It's called vulnerability, it's called exposure. And when the two are combined together, that's what we call it, that a disaster happened, or it actually multiplies its impacts. Now that social calculus have been missing for a very long period of time. I think we can give many examples. If anyone want to contest with me, anyone want to challenge me on that, I think I'll be extremely happy to do so. But anyway, let me challenge you. Maybe Faisal is sitting here, my own colleague from my own organization. That's always safe to pick somebody whom I know. What do you think about it? You think, let's take any disaster. Landslides.
Sir, I agree with you, because we, as humans, we've altered natural processes so much that it's no longer natural, it's at an accelerated rate. So I do agree with you.
So where is the human intervention in landslides? Why we are facing? Somebody was telling me that there are 33,000 potential landslides in Pakistan, which can actually happen, which can actually break at any point in time. And I was actually laughing about it. 33,000 or 3,300, something of this nature. And we, as NDRMF, we actually worked on 5 of them. So not a very stellar record anyway. But what could be the human intervention that we are actually in the land? Any other disasters? Any other? I mean, anyone wants to take it? Deforestation. Yeah. So I think that's what it happens. And then when we're talking about the social calculus, when talking about the communities and the people, it's not that the people are actually doing the deforestation by choice. If you go to Kashmir and if you go to Gilgit-Baltistan, they're not doing it by choice. They basically have to. Their lifestyles are so much dependent on it, and we haven't created, as development practitioners, as funding agencies, as implementing agencies, we did not create the alternative sources of fire for them, heat for them, and we did not provide them those opportunities. But that's maybe a bigger kind of a blame in which we need to take. The lower side of the blame is that we haven't even given them the awareness. I think even today we are sitting in this room and we are grappling with this kind of a very fundamental challenge, a very fundamental question. And just think about somebody who's sitting in a farm, in a remote area in Gilgit-Baltistan. For him or her, it might be even not an issue. So I think this is something. And what I really want to kind of highlight now. When we say that there's a human element and there is a community element, and by changing the perspective, by changing the approach, quite a radical shift, and a positive radical shift actually can take place in that. Now we see that it actually we have seen in the last floods as well, and we've seen that, is it just a coincidence, is it just a by chance that those districts, and this is our own study by the way, NDRMF study and the NDRMF observations, just before the flood 22, we were actually sitting and we were identifying the areas or the districts in Balochistan and Sindh which might be potentially vulnerable for drought. Washir Sahab, you agree? Yeah. And The coincidence is those districts were actually flooded just a few weeks after when we were discussing about it. So it just cannot be a coincidence, it cannot be a chance that those areas, those remote areas, those communities and those people who were at one point in time, and we're not talking about a long span of time, we're talking about maybe a few months or maybe a few weeks, they were exposed and they were vulnerable to drought, and then suddenly they were underwater. So something is fundamentally wrong. Something is which is not really functioning, which is not really happening, and that's what we are actually discussing today, and that's what I want to highlight today as well. Now, what is the connection between the development and the disasters? The question is basically very fundamental because they are very much interdependent on each other. The kind of developments we do and the kind of development projects and implementations we do, it can actually work in either way. It can reduce the risk, but it can be a risk accumulator as well. It can increase the risk as well. And we have seen in number of places, we have seen around the world as well, we have seen the number of places where actually it worked in that particular fashion. Now, with the right kind of approach, with the right kind of planning, with the right kind of financing, and with the right kind of awareness, with the right kind of community engagement, and with the right kind of project design processes, we can actually alter, we can shift the needle, we can shift the whole implement. And we can actually determine that any disaster, whether it be drought, it be wildfire, it will be flood, or it could be heat wave, and that can actually make a difference that who is going to live and who is going to die, whose cattle is going to be swept away and whose cattle is going to remain harmless, whose infrastructure, the house or the public health infrastructure in the remote villages is going to be saved, is going to remain intact, or it is not going to be available to them for the next season or for the next, or whose crop is going to be, which is a big source of the livelihood for the rural communities, is going to be intact or is going to be swept away as well. So I think this kind of a connection between the development and the disaster, which has been largely missing. So I think and for the fundamental element and aspect of it, that we actually start looking at disasters from a nature-less perspective or non-nature perspective. What it automatically means, what it implies, that once if we believe and we actually understand that the element of the nature by far is just not there, it means the disasters are preventable, they are avoidable, they are controllable, and sometimes they are quite completely preventable as well. So I think this is the point which I actually want you to carry forward, and which actually look into the development perspective as well. Now, by saying this nature-less perspective, it does not mean that there is no connection between the natural systems or the biospherical systems with the disasters. I mean, everyone is talking about climate change, and there is quite a kind of a strong urge to look everything from climate lens, which there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. But I think there is another aspect which is basically arising, and which might have some kind of a negative implications as well, still yet to be seen, but some negative implications, that this climatization, or let me call it this over climatization of every single aspect, developmental aspect, is it really supporting it or is it really harming it? Elevating poverty should be a goal by itself. Why to look at it from climate change lens? Human rights or gender, that should be a goal of its own self. Societies like us should be working extremely hard for alleviating the poverty, whether there's a climate change perspective, whether there's a climate change lens, or there's no climate change lens. Now, I think what is happening, and which is quite concerning as well, the climate change is actually increasing the risk. It's exacerbating the poverty. It's basically marginalizing the human rights and the gender rights and the a number of the livelihood of the people in the rural communities, and I can go on and on and on. I mean, this is literally an endless list. So I think while we are looking at the development from that perspective, I think we need to be mindful as well that whether this over-climatization is actually serving the purpose or not. And I think this is a very honest kind of a perspective has to be built, and it has to be evaluated whether our approach is right, or we might need to rethink about that. Why, by the way, human civilization is littered with these kind of examples where a kind of approach was coined, it basically became popular and became fashionable. If you look into the human history in the last, you don't need to go really far too long. If you look into the human history, you can find a number of incidents like this. You know, I don't know whether you people have read Henry Truman's 1949 Rise Up to 49 speech into the Congress. It's called the developmental speech, by the way, and where he basically laid out the global financial system and assured the world that this is going to bring the global stability, it's going to reduce the poverty, it's going to lift up the marginalized societies and the countries up to the level of industrialized nations. Now, if we re-look back into that speech, I think this looks completely hollow, this looks completely wrong. And I'm sure that you know, Henry Truman was very, you know, he was delivering his speech, he was delivering his address in the best of his judgment. But what we have seen that a number of elements in that was actually have proven wrong over the period. We haven't achieved the financial stability in the world. We are far, far away from it. You know, the poverty is perverse everywhere right now, you know, and similarly other issues as well. So I think this perspective to look the disasters from a developmental perspective and from nature-less perspective, I think this is important, and we need to learn about that. We need to internalize it, and we need to integrate into our practices. Now, the disasters are rooted in development failure. I very, very strongly believe that. And again, in my introduction, I said that I have reasons to believe that, because I have seen with my own eyes, I have served in the societies which have been actually pursuing the development, and they come up with all kind of stellar indicators, the GDP growth, you know, the export growth, the deficit coming down, and there are many shining and islands of success in the African context. I can name very few number of countries, and they came up with a very powerful economic indicators, but the poverty haven't gone down, you know, and the disasters or the risks to the disasters have not been addressed to those places. So if we look into it, how this whole paradigm, how this whole perspective have evolved, it basically taken the development as something which is building, which is infrastructure based, which is construction based, which is meant to be concrete. And we have seen, or we are seeing this in our own countries, the kind of development, or on the name of development, what is happening in this country. You see the mushrooming of the housing societies coming up. You know, one way of looking at it is basically improving the standard of living of common people. The other way of looking at it is basically grabbing the land, which the land is much more effectively, efficiently usable for some other purposes. And secondly, that we have to see that whether those kind of developments, they are not actually compromising, they're not marginalizing some of the aspects of the disaster. And I don't need to repeat and don't need to say that. We have seen in Islamabad some of those examples. So what is happening is basically a risk accumulation, and we have seen this in a number of places. The development projects, the development interventions, they actually accumulate the risk. And that is happening because of the inappropriate development planning processes. And as I said, the development planning process has been completely disconnected from the realities on the ground. There is no degree of inclusiveness. Most of the projects, and this is not unique to Pakistan, this is actually happening in several other parts of the world as well, where most of the developmental projects, they are actually designed, approved at the federal capitals in rooms where many of those people, they might not have actually been to those places. And I'll be very honest, heading up NDRMF, and sometimes actually I am actually approving some of those projects and have not gone to those areas. I don't know the ground realities. I can't really connect myself to those people, and I feel kind of a level of discomfort that, okay, is this something which we should be doing? Have we covered all the aspects of it or not? But then, there are other realities as well. There's a timeline, there's a donor pressure, there's a number of other things which we have to comply with, which basically push us to get the project through. And then with the faith and with the belief that it's going to bring some level of comfort, or it's going to improve some level of livelihood or life of the people over there. But I think there's a fundamental disconnect between the communities and the people and the ground realities. I think everyone is talking about here in Pakistan in the context of the last year's flood. The fundamental reason for those floods basically is that those natural, or shouldn't be saying the natural, but those water channels which basically established or evolved over the many decades. I mean, they have been blocked, and that basically blocks the water pathways and accumulate the water. And I think this is absolutely correct, but we can see this from many other areas as well. Building codes is one area as well, and where the building standards have not been really followed. And I really do not see that this kind of developmental planning process is actually, there is any ambition or even a desire to incorporate all these elements into it and to come up with something. So what is happening is basically this inappropriate development planning process, which is very deep, that is basically accumulating the risk. So on the name of development, we are actually accumulating the higher degree of risk for disasters. The second is socioeconomic indicators, low social development indicators, sustainability, education, health, etc., etc. I think that's a no-brainer. Everyone understands that. We know that disasters hit poor disproportionately, much harder, and they hit those communities, those segments of the communities who are already vulnerable. Now, in a way, disasters, one of the secular view of the disasters is they are very indiscriminate. Disasters don't really see that who they are basically hitting, or who they are. So the disaster basically don't see, and they don't discriminate. So I think it is the socioeconomic indicators. It's the social calculus which I was talking about. It's the people who have the kind of a capacity and they have the capability which basically make them vulnerable. So this is one of the reasons. I think that's a fundamental development failure. If we haven't been able to improve the livelihood of people, if we haven't been able to provide them the kind of the sources in the last so many years, in the context of Pakistan, at least 76 years, I think we are responsible for that. So institutional weaknesses, we know that this is a very popular argument in Pakistan, that the institutions they lack capacities. And I think we've been hearing this for last many decades. I'm not saying this, I'm not denying to this fact. It's true that there is a lack of capacity for national institutions, but I think why it is still remain a fundamental challenge and fundamental problem is because no concerted effort has been made to improve this, to actually address this issue. I think it's only very recently, and I'm talking about very recently, in the last few months actually, is the first time I'm actually hearing that this challenge has been acknowledged. And it has been acknowledged by the development agencies, by the development partners and international institutions, and they actually want to address this and they want to do something about it. Now, the community engagement, I think I already spoken about it. Failure to engage, so it's basically an element of inclusiveness which is not really happening, and a lack of social protection. There is absolutely, whatever the social protection systems and mechanisms which were there, which were in existence, if you're talking about Pakistan, they basically have weakened over the period. And that again has happened on the name of development, urban development. When we're talking about it's happening creating the urban slums, and the people are so pushed to their own needs, I think you don't really expect them that they are helping their neighbors or they're helping the communities. So if that was only a very informal but very strong and very rigid social protection system, which we actually managed to lose it. So the dichotomy, I think this is my last slide. So what is the, I think I've already spoken this a lot about this. So the development approach basically have evolved, which is based on the construction and infrastructure projects. I think we haven't really evolved to that, and it's only very, very recently, and now we are talking about nature-based solutions. And this still is actually, most of the projects we see this as a very minute or a kind of a subset of a larger, very larger project. If you're setting up a dam, if you're setting up a motorway, and normally it is, we're going to put some trees along the line or anything like this. We haven't really explored this area fully yet. And that again is one of the risk accumulator which has happened. And poorly planned development projects which undermine the pre-existing capacities, resilient, and basically have taken away the adaptive capacity from the communities as well. The last point is extremely important, and it actually applies to many of the development agencies. When the priorities shift, when the priorities changes because of the disaster, it might not be a very big issue for many of the stakeholders, but if you ask to the donor agencies, it is a very big issue. So, and it has been undermining and marginalizing the developmental priorities. So the money which could have been spent for disaster risk reduction, the money which could have been spent for setting up the early warning system, and by the way, this is a very live and practical example, and the example which actually happened in the case of NDRMF. The money which could have been spent for flood protections, or raising the awareness, or community development. In a case of disaster, the priorities suddenly shift. And that money, that funding goes into the relief effort, which is absolutely important, which is absolutely necessary. But I think I'm talking about the approach, I'm talking about the methodology which is there, which basically shifts the whole equation, because then the society and the community have to pay the price for the next many decades. And I think this is what we are suffering. I thank you very much. Thank you.